You know that feeling when you're trying to make sense of a big historical event or maybe a really complex piece of writing and you just feel swamped?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Like you're wading through tons of information, just trying to figure out what actually matters.
Exactly. Like, what are the key takeaways here? Well, that's precisely why we're here doing this deep dive.
Yeah, we try to cut through that noise.
We take a close look at a collection of sources, kind of pull out the most crucial insights, the stuff that gives you that moment, real understanding without all the overload.
Basically, we want to give you that shortcut to being well-informed, offer some clarity and context on topics that matter.
And today we're embarking on, I think, a really fascinating exploration. We're looking at the biblical text of Matthew chapter 24. Specifically, we're examining it through the lens of the destruction of Jerusalem back in 70 AD.
Okay.
And our main source material, it's insights drawn from David Padfield's work, The Destruction of Jerusalem.
The idea is to shed some light on the historical background and maybe a primary meaning of this passage. It's obviously a very widely discussed part of the Bible.
Hugely discussed.
Yeah. So we're focusing on one particular perspective here, one way of looking at events that, frankly, have been interpreted in countless ways over the centuries.
Okay, let's get into it. To really grasp Matthew 24, we kind of need to back up just a little bit, look at what happens right before it in Matthew 23.
The immediate context.
Exactly. Jesus is in the temple, and he's really laying into the religious leaders some pretty strong language.
Yeah, strong is putting it mildly. It's quite direct, quite sharp.
Totally. He calls them sons of those who murdered the prophets, a brood of vipers. I mean, not holding back at all.
No.
And then he finishes with this really powerful lament over the city. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you know the one. How often I wanted to gather your children, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate.
Wow. Yeah, that paints a pretty stark picture of coming judgment, doesn't it? A sense of impending doom, almost.
Definitely sets the stage. And then, right after this, as Jesus is leaving the temple complex, his disciples start pointing out the buildings like, wow, look how magnificent these are.
Understandable, I suppose. It was an impressive sight.
Oh, absolutely. But Jesus's response is just staggering. He says, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down.
Imagine hearing that. This incredible structure, the absolute heart of their religious life, just gone. Rubble.
It must have been completely shocking. Just, earth-shattering for them.
Right.
So naturally, once they get away from the crowds, up on the Mount of Olives, they pull them aside privately.
And they ask the big question.
They do. Tell us, they ask, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?
And it's really interesting how they link those things together, isn't it? Devil's destruction, Jesus' return, the end of the age. It's all sort of one big event in their minds at this point.
Yeah, that connection seems crucial. Like for them, the temple falling felt like the end of the world as they knew it. So it makes sense they'd lump it all together.
It does, and that leads us right into the main argument from our source material, from Padfield.
Okay.
He basically argues that a big chunk of Matthew 24, specifically verses 4 through 35, is primarily talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD.
Right, that specific event.
Exactly. And then the rest of the chapter, after verse 35, shifts focus to the second coming of Christ, a different event potentially much further in the future.
So a two-part prophecy, in a way.
That's the idea. And it really hinges on the timing, the scope, what Jesus was predicting right then and there.
And a really key piece of evidence for this view, something Padfield emphasizes, is what Jesus says in verse 34.
Yes, the generation statement.
Exactly. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. That seems to set a pretty clear time frame, doesn't it?
It certainly seems to. So the big question becomes, what exactly does this generation mean in that context?
Good question. Let's dig into that word, generation. Our source looks at a couple of well-respected Greek dictionaries, or lexicons.
Okay.
Joseph Henry Thayer's lexicon, for instance. It gives meanings like a begetting, birth, the whole multitude of men living at the same time, and significantly an age, the space of from 30 to 33 years.
Right, so not necessarily just lineage, but a contemporary group or even a set period of time.
Precisely. Understanding that original Greek nuance is important. And then there's W.E. Vine's dictionary.
What does Vine add?
Well, Vine also connects it to becoming. and mentions meanings like a family, a race, but also, again, the whole multitude of men living at the same time. And he specifically notes it can mean an age, i.e. a period ordinarily occupied by each successive generation, say, of 30 or 40 years.
30 or 40 years, okay.
So think about the timeline. Jesus is saying this around, let's say, 30 AD.
Right.
And Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD.
40 years.
Exactly. It fits right within that common understanding of a generation at the time.
That's quite compelling, isn't it? It strongly suggests that Jesus intended for these specific prophecies, the ones leading up to verse 34, to be fulfilled within the lifetime of the people actually listening to him.
It does seem that way. So we have this potential time frame, but did all these things actually happen within that generation?
That's the next logical step. We need to look at the historical record.
And this is where a really crucial historical witness comes in, Flavius Josephus.
Josephus. Yes, absolutely vital for understanding this period.
Tell us a bit about him. Why is his testimony so valuable here?
Well, Josephus was, he was a Jewish priest. He was actually a leader in the Jewish revolt against Rome initially.
Oh, wow. So he was involved.
Deeply involved.
Yeah.
But he was captured by the Romans. And then, crucially, he was present and witnessed the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD firsthand.
So he saw it all happen.
He saw it all. And he wrote about it extensively in his book, The Wars of the Jews. It's an incredible, if often harrowing, eyewitness account.
Okay, so let's use Josephus and maybe some other historical bits to look at the specific things Jesus predicted in Matthew 24. First up, false Christs or false messiahs.
Right. Matthew 24, verse 5. Jesus warns, "For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many."
Did Josephus mention anything like that?
He certainly did.
Oh.
He actually describes several figures who seem to fit this description perfectly. There was, for instance, an Egyptian false prophet. This guy gathered a huge following, something like 30,000 people apparently.
30,000? That's enormous.
Huge. And get this. His plan was to lead them to the Mount of Olives, the exact place Jesus gave this prophecy, and then somehow magically enter Jerusalem from there.
Wow. The parallel with the Mount of Olives is pretty striking.
It really is. It adds this layer of historical resonance. And Josephus also mentions another figure, a magician named Theudas.
Theudas, what did he do?
He convinced a lot of people to follow him down to the Jordan River. He claimed he could part the waters, like Moses.
Okay, so definitely people claiming extraordinary messianic type powers.
Exactly. It shows this wasn't just an isolated incident. There was this climate of messianic expectation and, unfortunately, deception. People were looking for a deliverer, which made them vulnerable.
Right, a very turbulent time religiously and politically. Okay, what's next in the prophecy? Jesus mentions wars and rumors of wars, Matthew 24.6.
Yes, and interestingly, he tells the disciples not to be troubled or alarmed by these things.
Which is maybe easy for us to read past, but what was the reality like in Judea and the wider Roman world leading up to 70 AD? Was it peaceful?
Not at all. Quite the opposite. Our source points to the Roman historian Tacitus.
Tacitus, right.
Tacitus described this very period as being, and I quote roughly, "rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace."
Doesn't sound very peaceful.
No. I mean, the empire saw 4 emperors violently overthrown in quick succession around this time. There were civil wars, foreign wars. It was incredibly unstable.
And Josephus, does he paint a similar picture closer to home in Judea?
Oh, absolutely. He gives some horrifying details. He talks about widespread violence and internal conflict. For example, he records an incident in Caesarea where tensions between Jewish people and others erupted, and he claims over 20,000 Jews were killed in just 1 hour.
20,000 in an hour.
That's his account. He gives you a sense of the scale and the sheer brutality of the conflict simmering just beneath the surface and often breaking out.
Yeah.
Definitely fits wars and rumors of wars.
Yeah, that certainly qualifies. Okay, next prediction, famines and pestilences, Matthew 24.7.
Right. For this one, we don't even necessarily need to go outside the New Testament initially.
Ah.
The book of Acts, chapter 11, actually records prophets coming down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, Agabus, predicting a severe famine throughout the entire Roman world.
And it mentions when this happened.
Yes, it says this took place during the reign of Claudius Caesar, which fits our time frame.
Okay. And does Josephus back this up?
He does. He specifically mentions a great famine hitting Jerusalem during Claudius's reign, so severe that Queen Helena of Edibene, a convert to Judaism, actually organized relief efforts, importing shiploads of grain from Egypt and figs from Cyprus.
So, historical confirmation of a major famine.
Yes. And Tacitus, again, mentions food shortages and famine around this time, which some people apparently interpreted as supernatural warnings. And of course, famine, disease, pestilence often go hand in hand, historically speaking.
Makes sense. Weakened populations, poor sanitation. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Jesus also mentioned earthquakes in various places, also verse 7.
Earthquakes. Now, obviously, they didn't have seismographs back then, so records are based on historical writings.
Right.
But our source references a compilation by a writer named J. Marcellus Kick. He looked at classical writers from that period.
And what did he find?
Kick listed documented earthquakes in the years leading up to 70 AD in places like Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, and even in Judea itself.
So activity in the region.
Seems so. And perhaps the most famous one from that era, though a bit further away, was the major earthquake that heavily damaged Pompeii in, I think it was 63 AD. A significant event people in the Roman world would have known about.
Right, that Pompeii earthquake is well known. Okay, what else? Luke's version of this discourse adds something interesting.
Ah, yes. Luke 21.11. It includes fearful sights and great signs from heaven.
That sounds dramatic. Did Josephus record anything that might fit that description?
He recorded some truly remarkable things. Things that people at the time certainly would have interpreted as fearful signs.
Like what?
Well, he describes this incredibly violent storm one night, fierce winds, torrential rain, constant lightning, terrifying thunder, and the earth shaking. Josephus himself felt it was an omen, a sign of impending destruction.
Okay, a severe storm could definitely feel like a sign. Anything else?
Oh yeah. He recounts some really extraordinary phenomena. A star that looked like a sword hanging over Jerusalem for a whole year.
A whole year?
Yeah, and a comet that was visible for a year as well. He talks about an incredibly bright light shining around the temple altar at night. So bright it seemed like daytime for half an hour.
Wow.
And maybe the strangest. He describes the huge, heavy eastern gate of the inner temple, made of brass, needing 20 men to move it, swinging open on its own accord in the middle of the night.
Okay, those are definitely unusual. Fearful sights and great signs seems like a fair description from their perspective.
Absolutely. Whether you view them as literal miracles, misinterpretations of natural events, or maybe legendary accretions, for the people living through it, experiencing or hearing about these things, they would have added enormously to the sense of dread and divine warning.
Yeah, you can imagine. Okay, another big one. Jesus says, "This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." That's Matthew 24.11. The end here in this interpretation, meaning the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right, and that sounds like a massive task, doesn't it? Preaching the gospel to the whole world in just, 30, 40 years.
Seems like a tall order back then.
It does. But our source points to the Apostle Paul. In his letter to the Colossians, written probably in the early 60s AD, he speaks of the gospel, which you heard and which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven.
Every creature under heaven. Now, that might be a bit of hyperbole, maybe? Rhetoric?
It could well be rhetorical language to emphasize the vast spread, but it certainly indicates that Paul at least felt the gospel message had achieved an incredibly wide reach by that time, well before 70 AD.
Okay. And what about the other apostles and early missionaries?
Well, we have strong traditions, recorded by early church historians about where they went. Andrew supposedly went to Scythia, north of the Black Sea. Philip to Phrygia in modern Turkey. Bartholomew possibly to India. Matthew to Persia and Ethiopia. Thomas reportedly reached India too. James the Less in Egypt. Thaddeus in Persia. Simon the Zealot maybe Egypt, North Africa, even Britain, according to some traditions. John Mark founded the church in Alexandria, Egypt.
Wow, that covers a lot of ground.
It really does. Even if some specific details are debated by historians, the overall picture from these traditions is one of intense missionary activity, radiating out across the known world, the Roman Empire, and beyond within that first generation.
So the idea of the gospel reaching all nations as a witness before 70 AD seems plausible within the context of the time.
Plausible, yes. The known world, the oikoumene as they understood it, seems to have been significantly penetrated by the gospel message.
Okay, one more specific prediction to look at. Jesus warned his followers about persecution. Mark's gospel puts it this way. They'd be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. Mark 13.9.
Another one where the book of Acts provides ample evidence.
So.
Well, think about it. Peter and John dragged before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high council, right near the beginning, in Acts 4.
Right.
Stephen's trial before the Sanhedrin and his subsequent stoning in Acts 7. James, the brother of John, executed by King Herod Agrippa I, and Peter imprisoned by the same king in Acts 12.
Okay, yeah.
And then look at Paul's life. He stands before the proconsul Gallio in Corinth, before Governor Felix in Caesarea, then Governor Festus, then King Agrippa II.
And finally appeals to Caesar himself in Rome.
Exactly. It's a pattern repeated over and over. Arrests, beatings, trials before both Jewish and Roman authorities, just as Jesus predicted.
So these accounts and Acts really do seem to directly mirror what Jesus warned about: persecution, standing before rulers. It was happening.
It clearly shows the very real dangers and the official opposition the early Christians faced, fulfilling that specific part of the prophecy well within that first generation.
Okay. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, looking back at the prophecies in Matthew 24, verses 4 to 35, and comparing them with the historical accounts, especially from Josephus and also other New Testament writings, the source material we've looked at makes a pretty strong case, doesn't it?
It does seem to present a compelling argument for a direct historical connection between many of those specific predictions and the events surrounding Jerusalem's destruction within that first generation.
Yeah. False Christs, wars, famines, earthquakes, strange signs, the spread of the gospel, persecution. The pieces seem to fit that time frame.
So if this interpretation holds, it means that for Jesus' original audience, those disciples on the Mount of Olives, these weren't necessarily predictions about something thousands of years away.
Right. They were warnings about events they themselves, or at least people of their time, their generation, would likely witness.
It gives the whole discourse a real sense of urgency and immediacy.
It really does. It offers a very specific, historically grounded way to understand these really pivotal and often debated biblical passages.
A perspective rooted in the first century context.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it? And stepping back a bit, how much does understanding the original historical context change how we read any ancient text or prophecy?
That's a great question. It prompts you to always consider the original audience, the immediate circumstances.
Exactly. What other famous passages, maybe ones we think we understand, might reveal new layers of meaning if we did a similar deep dive into their original setting? It encourages a more, nuanced reading, maybe.
A more informed approach, definitely, thinking about who it was written for and why back then.
Yeah. So something for you, the listener, to maybe ponder. And for those of you who are keen to explore this specific topic on Matthew 24 and Jerusalem in more depth, our source material, Padfield's work, actually references further resources, more detailed articles, even entire books focused just on the destruction of Jerusalem and its connection to these prophecies.
Good to know. So people can dig even deeper if they want to.
Exactly. They're out there if you want to continue your own learning journey on this.